Greetings and how are you wherever you are? Today is the 4th of July, the day the United States gained its independence. And I thought it was interesting to do a video on what the July the 4th means to an African chef or food activist or African intellectual. And the reason why I thought about doing a live is because the idea of what July the 4th means to an African like me is problematic, because on one side I know a little bit or more about maybe average or above average what United States means relative to Africa and the history of Africa. So it will be a dishonesty on my part to claim that I celebrate history of the United States independence the very same way maybe another person who is American might necessarily celebrate the history of the United States. Simply because I'm a naturalized citizen of the United States does not mean that culturally, intellectually, that I abandon my African connection or that I ignore the historical connection, racial relationship between America and people of African descent and the connection between Africa and the United States. July 4th is a country that is the day that America became independent in 1776. And I know that the history of that struggle for independence for America is very, very directly connected to food in so many ways, but we can be very simplistic and just simply talk about one tiny bit of the struggle, which is the tea, tax on tea. So tax is the basis primarily that formed the justification or the trigger of the struggle of the American colony to fight against the mother Britain to become independent, because they claim taxation without representation is tyranny. And if you didn't know, for those who don't know, just a brief history might be in order. So Britain had gained control violently over the tea trade in the world. The tea that we know as the green tea is actually Chinese tea. It's not, in Kenya, we used to call it English tea. Some people still call it English tea, but that's cultural misappropriation. The tea was first grown by the Chinese in China. And until 1854, I think, the control of the Chinese of tea was totally in the hands of the Chinese. And it was not until Robert Fortune, who was a Scottish botanist, was hired by Britain to go and infiltrate China and go to the interior to be able to get tea plants that can be grown by the British Empire in what's called Taiwan today. In those days, it was called Ceylon. That's when they started growing, the British started growing the tea, and eventually they would overtake the tea industry. That's just one part of it. The other part of it, which is very, very important to mention, is that Britain chartered a company called East Indian Company, the East Indian Company, to actually go and to do two things: destroy the textile industry in India, and at the same time wrestle the control of the tea from the Chinese. And the British East Indian Company had an army that was bigger than the army of the UK or England at that time, because they knew that there was no way, or England knew, at least to be clear, that there was no way England was going to rise to power and gain any market share in the textile industry if they did not crush and destroy the textile industry in India. India was the dominant market provider of textile and they have been doing this for a long time. And so England did not stand a chance. So they created this chartered this company, and the process was so violent that they had to use opium to destroy China and break the China's back and wrestle the control of tea from the Chinese. And what they did is they went and grew opium. They controlled the growing of opium in India, and then they'll take that opium through the Malaluka Strait, which is today, what's the name of that country? By the Lee Kuan Yew's country. And they would go and Malaysia and whatever the country is. I'm forgetting the name of the country right now. And it'll come to me. But they'll take that China opium all the way around. And Singapore is the name of the country. They'll take all that tea around and opium around, and they'll go and trade the opium for tea, because the Chinese say they only want to buy their tea with silver and gold. So that's a very big connection between tea and the United States struggle to be independent. And how did that come about? Now, during that time, America, you're talking about in 1850s, 1860s. That's almost like 100 years before America became independent. No. That was after America had already become independent, like maybe 1850s, about 75 years, or 60 or 75 years after the country became independent. So, no. Well, that was way before, sorry. Before the English gained control over the tea, they were buying tea from China. So they will go and buy tea, they bring from China, they bring to England. Then the American colonial subjects, quote unquote, would go to England, which is the place where they come from, and then they'll buy the tea and then come and sell it here. But because the king wanted to raise more taxes, he said, hey, look, guys, and there was political differences. They say, hey, look, we want to make more taxes. We cannot allow you to come from America to come and buy tea here in the UK, and then, or London, it was England at that time, and then go and sell it in America for a better price, higher price. That is already undercutting us. What we want to do, we want to bring the tea and sell the tea to you at a higher price that you will come and buy it in the UK. That way, those people who are in the tea industry, who are connected to the royal family or the political powers in those days, can make money by bringing tea here. That's one. The alternative was that if you want to come and buy tea here, then, and even when we bring the tea here, we're going to charge a high price because we're going to add a tax on it. It was called the tea tax. So the British colonialists, the American colony decided, hey, we don't want to pay that tax. Why are we being taxed to England? We don't vote there. We're not represented. We are a colony here by ourselves. So in Boston, they decided they to create the Boston Tea Party. And what they did is they waited for the ship. That was the next time the ship was coming. And there was a prominent guy called Reeves, who is remembered in that history as a guy who looked out until he made gave the signal when the ship showed up in the shores. And when the ship came, they made the signal, and they all went on shore, and they attacked the ship, and they poured all the tea into the tea. Why? In protest, because human beings are born free. To be human, as Freire said, to be human is to be free. So that started what we call the American Civil War, and the American War of Independence, or the Revolutionary War, as they call it. And it was because of the struggle for justice for America that America became a nation. Very, very long story. Has a lot of sad stories about how the Iroquois nation was broken, and one of the nations in the 6 nations in the Iroquois nation were duped into supporting the U.S., and the promise that was made to them was not fulfilled. So that's why America is considered the second nation. The Native Americans had the first nation. They had a constitution. So it's not true when somebody say the American Constitution is the most free, forward-thinking constitution in the world, because he left out the Native Americans, the first nation. He left out women. He left out people of African descent. So many other things. So there's so many challenges that are raised by constitutionalists about why the American Constitution is not that superior as some people would want to make believe. They say it's bad, but it's not nearly as superior as people make it out to be. But on that sense, my point is that Africa, just like Americans, have had a long history with this country. Had a long history with this country in the way in which Africans have been treated, going back to 1619 when the first Africans landed in this country, and they landed as indentured servants because the indenture system was what was going on at that time. And there were Africans who finished their indenture, and they were released at the end of the indenture. They were given some supplies. They started their own land. There were Africans who actually owned a lot of land, like one venture. There's one African American who was known to have over 100, first one to have over 100 acres of land. He had slaves himself, or he tried to get indentured servants, but he did not. I think Venture Smith is his name. I might not remember exactly his name, but I'll confirm that. But so we have a very complex history, and I don't think that it makes sense for us to pretend that the history has been smooth, and where there are grievances that to be raised, that we should pass on those grievances, or we should either sweep them under the rug or pretend as though they don't exist. So for that reason, I wanted to remember the words of Frederick Douglass, who said, "What is 4th of July to an American slave?" And he asked those questions at a lecture that he gives after the 4th of July, because he didn't want to give on the 4th of July. Because he did not think the 4th of July represented people of African descent, and it's not unconscionable for people who are oppressing Black people to express, or African people, to expect them to celebrate because other people are celebrating. It's cool. Other people are celebrating. It's all their right. They have every right to celebrate. But nobody's obligated to celebrate because somebody else is celebrating. I don't get satiated because other people eat. So that's that. So that's why I want to talk about the 4th of July. And the 4th of July has those issues, but it also has lessons or reason to celebrate. There are people who wrote the American Constitution, like Thomas Paine, who did a lot of sacrifice to make sure that some of the tyrannies that were going on from monarchies, from religious tyrannies, would eventually be defeated and human beings can breathe free. And for that, he pays a hefty price. He's died a lonely man, because a lot of people who are working with him initially ostracized him, turned their back on him, and his funeral was attended by just a few men. And some of the body parts were not there. He wasn't buried in the whole body. And there are parts of Thomas Paine that are in different places. And I know there was one Black man that showed up for his funeral. And I definitely would have been one of those Black men if I was living, or an additional Black man if I was alive, because I have mad respect for people who sacrifice for justice. It's something that just flows in my blood. Can't shake it. So for that reason, I do have reasons to celebrate. I do reasons to raise questions. I do have reasons to reflect. And it's still ironical that just like people were fighting for the tax against the tea tax in American Revolutionary War, I'm still struggling for food. And one of the things that I've celebrated the most And one of the things that I struggle the most about is just dealing with the fact that America is so wealthy and yet the food is so poor. So just like the tea tax, we're still struggling for justice, because while the Americans in the Revolutionary War were struggling against a tax on tea, we are struggling to get food justice, not only for tea, but for all food. It's so difficult to get just food, what I call for just food, which is food with justice. And unlike 1770s, or 1760s, 1770s, then now we are not only struggling to get justice for tea, we are struggling for the environment, for food, for clean food, for legislation that will prevent certain toxic chemicals that are called forever chemicals that didn't exist in 1770s and 1760s when the Revolutionary War, American Revolutionary War was going on. So that's one thing to think about and to ponder on today. The other one is the relationship that America has with Africa. In those times, America was engaged in the enslavement of people of African descent. African people did not have any rights. There were property, there were chattel. And I'm reminded by one of my favorite poems by Brown called Old Lamb. Old Lamb is one of my favorite poems. And if you haven't listened to Old Lamb, if I had another gadget, I probably would have played Old Lamb. Check out that poem by Mr. Brown, Old Lamb. And so actually I'll play in the next video. I'll come up with a way of finding a way I can play Old Lamb, just because. And sometimes when I give residencies or lectures at American college campuses, that's one of my favorite poems to start with if I don't play Fela Kuti's music, a song to start. So that's problematic for me. And just like African Americans were suffering in the hands of America in those days because of racist attitudes, Africa is still suffering today in big ways. Africa is in debt, just like Africa was suffering in those days by having some of its people being captured and sold in debt by some Africans and some white people. But there are some Africans now that continue to sell Africans, and their mind wasn't necessarily selling direct slavery, but they are still putting them in debt slavery. And debt slavery was the next form of slavery, because when slavery ended in the United States legal slavery ended. It didn't really end, because it was conditional ending, that you are free if you didn't, unconditionally. You're a citizen conditionally if you didn't commit any crime, which doesn't apply to other people. Other people can commit crime, then they can serve their time, and the idea of double jeopardy did not apply to them. But for black people, if you have committed crime, you could be arrested, or trumped up charges could be filed against you, and for that reason, then you could be sold as a slave by the state, And if you have children, those children belong to the state, and the state can sell them can lease those children to plantations, to companies, and they can make a profit for it. Alabama did it, Mississippi did it, Georgia did it, following the end of Reconstruction, after the Civil War in the United States. So I have a lot of mixed feelings on one side about some of the sad history that Africa has had to go through and still going through. In amongst these Palestinians, I had a very good Palestinian friend when I was in first year and second year in college, and we used to share a lot of stories, and I would learn firsthand from him. And one of the very first thing two things happened because of that friendship. I learned about the Nakba, which is the catastrophe, when the Palestinians were kicked out of their land when the state of Israel was created, and a lot of families lost their land. So they actually have a name for that occurrence, that incident. They call Nakba, al-Nakba, or the catastrophe. So I feel too that African has its own catastrophe, day of catastrophe, or incident of catastrophe. And slavery and colonialism is still two sides of the same coin of the same catastrophe. And the continued enslavement of debt is a form of the continuation of that catastrophe. And ironically, that's the same thing that happened, that after African Americans were emancipated, they did not get 40 acres in a meal, but were gypped, and they ended up being sharecroppers, and they were tied to debt peonage where they would work as sharecroppers. They could not read and write. They were not allowed to keep their books, and as a result, they were in perpetual debt. They could never pay the debt. The debt was always inflated because they can read. As a matter of fact, Dr. King's mother or father, yeah, their parents had to run away from the sharecropping arrangement they had because the owner of the land found out that Dr. King's mother knew how to read and write. So he would tell the father how much they owed before he went to go and talk to the landowner. So, and to learn to be a well-read or educated African American in those days was dangerous, was considered as to be almost like an offense. So they knew the families was going to probably be prosecuted because of by the Ku Klux Klan. And so they left the farm and they moved to Georgia. That's how Dr. King, the life of Dr. King changed through the life of the family. He started living in the city, and now we know the story of Dr. King. So, yeah, I'm saying all that to say that the struggle is still continuing. We can celebrate as though America has given us all the rights that we deserve as African, both here and abroad. By Africans, I mean Africans in general, both African American, it doesn't matter. The struggle is still one, and it's just divided. It doesn't help to divide the case. In fact, it helps to look at it as one big catastrophe, and we are more likely to deal with it accordingly. So, yeah, I'm not going to be long on this one, but I'm going to say that that's my feeling, that we have a lot of work to do. But in the same sense, I'm very, very happy to be in the U.S. because if there's anything that I can say I came to the U.S., I came to the U.S. to eat. The quality of food in Africa is getting so bad that I doubt that I will be able to eat what I'm eating. I've been eating. I haven't eaten food that's not organic since February 28, 1991. I've actively, intentionally worked to make sure that I don't eat food that's not organic. Because to eat bad food is a form of self-colonization or self-enslavement. And not only enslaving myself, but enslaving the future generation, because we have toxic chemicals that are so bad that they are epigenetic. They change our genes. So I'm not only making it difficult for me to be healthy, but also for future generation through the sperm and the eggs of those people or the genes of those people who procreate as Africans. So yeah, so let's think about that. Let's think about our role and our responsibility to keep the struggle alive. But more specifically to understand that food is a key component of our enslavement and our colonization. We were colonized primarily on the grounds of food. Africans were brought in this country to work on the plantations. And there's no better place, especially than for me to do the work that I'm doing than in the American South. There's a lot for me to learn in the American South. There are so many things that happen in the American South that can be instructive in the struggle for justice. And if I can share one story, during the 1880s, America was having pandemic of what they call pellagra. Pellagra is a form of disease that happens due to lack of thiamine. And if you look at a lot of breads, they are enriched with thiamine because of the pandemic that happened those days. And that pandemic was so bad that a lot of people were really suffering. And one of the things that pellagra does, it makes your skin red very easy when you go to the sun. And some people think that's where the term redneck comes from. And also it makes people very violent and very rational, likely to be depressed. And so some of the overseers in the slave plantation in the 1800s might have been angry and very violent because of pellagra. But the southern researchers did not want to hear when a northern scientist found out the pandemic, because they say, hey, that's a Yankee who is trying to interfere with our southern culture. And the South didn't want to change because of pride. And for sure, the reason why pellagra happened is because the South was primarily eating 3M: meal, meat, and molasses. So cornmeal, molasses, and meat, which is pork primarily. And those things are very deficient in niacin. And yes, niacin actually the one that causes the lack of niacin in diet is the one who causes pellagra. And African Americans didn't suffer from pellagra because a lot of African Americans kept kitchen gardens, which we don't do now, probably nowhere close to the level we did. So we also have to question ourselves. This is a mutual responsibility. We also have a responsibility to make sure we play our part in this fight to make sure that we gain food justice. And our liberation is tied to food also, or includes food. It's not only limited to being allowed to eat at restaurants that are serving bad food, or going on vacation, or flying, or what have you, and food is killing us. So, but the pellagra is interesting because it's one pandemic that happened in the American South. And the American South was so proud, because of pride, did not act on it immediately. So it was prolonged much longer than it could have been. And there was a lot of disagreements between the Northerners and the Southerners when it comes to the extent of the pandemic of pellagra. So that's in the 1880s, and now in 1890s, and now we have the same thing. The South is suffering. People are suffering because of eating poor diet. I was in a meeting, and the discussion that was talking about soul food, and I say the term soul food is problematic to me, because we seem to be so tied up to just eating food of the past that we can't shake that from ourselves. And that's not food that we ate that was most ideal to us. That was a food that we ate during our catastrophe. So we have to figure out how we can eat better. And that's part of the reason why I've come up with a new cuisine I call Afrofuturistic conscious cuisine. We can't eat in the past. We have to eat in the future. So yeah, so that's about 29 minutes. That's good time. So those are my few thoughts about why we have to struggle to be totally free, why it's our responsibility, and all that struggle has to start with food before we go to other things. 29 minutes. Have a good one.